Thank you, Sam, and thank you so much, and thank you to the Roadhouse. Thank you so much for coming out here tonight. I know this past weekend was an adventure. Well, now we will try to have the adventure of the kind that we choose to have, the kinds that we can have in stories. Stories that take us everywhere, but leave our houses and our cars alone. Nasruddin was sitting somewhat like you are all tonight. He was sitting at the coffee house when a young man came up to him and he said, "Mullah, would you please bless my marriage? I'm getting married in 2 days." Nasruddin's face broke into a wide smile and he said, "Of course I will. You have my blessing. I love weddings. Marriage is wonderful." The young man stopped for a moment and he said, "Mullah, if you think marriage is so wonderful, why have you never married?" "Oh, I wanted to," said Nasruddin. "I went looking for the perfect wife. I went to Cairo, and there I met a woman who was beautiful, but we had nothing to talk about. I went to Istanbul, and there I met a woman who was wise, but we could never agree on anything. Finally, I found her. In Isfahan, I met a woman who was wise. She was beautiful. We could spend all night talking until the sun came up, and still we would want to keep on talking." "Mullah," cried the young man, "why did you not marry her?" "Alas for me," said Nasruddin, "she was looking for the perfect husband." I've been giving it a lot of thought of what I should tell for my second story. There are so many stories out there of strong women, and they're all so strong that they're all fighting to be told tonight. In fact, they're so strong, I feel like slapping them down and saying, "Look, I can't tell all of your stories. Now wait your turn." So I'm still trying to think. But I think, I think we'll go with a story that I never get to tell anywhere else, because this strong woman gets slapped down a little bit for telling this story. So we'll get to enjoy that tonight. I don't remember when I first came to the city. I know it must have been some time before I was a young woman. But it wasn't hard to remember what happened after I came to the city. My parents were very poor, and they soon died one after the other. And there I was, by myself. It isn't easy for a woman who lives by herself. Not in any city, but certainly not in the great city where the king himself held court. And eventually, after working at this store or trying to run this business or sell something, well, let's just say that I ended up in a position I had never dreamed I would be in when I was a small girl. But that might have been the beginning of the adventure. In Jericho, you see, we lived with a great wall around us. We were well protected. In fact, the wall was so thick that many of us had our homes in the wall. The wall itself was large enough that you could have your house in the wall, and that was where my house was. And that is no doubt why the two men from the army that had gathered outside the wall found their way to my roof. And it wasn't only that, because I know that as they walked through the marketplace and they asked for directions and they asked for a place, yes, I know, you can't believe it, these were men asking for directions, but they did. And they asked for a place where they could get to know someone and be safe. I know someone said, oh, you want to get to know someone. Well, if that's what you want, you go see Rahab. Rahab, she'll get to know you real well. I was just in the market getting the groceries, and when I came back to my house, who should be in there but two strange men? I like to pick the men I bring back to my house, thank you very much. But the thing was, as frightened as I was to find two men in my house, they were even more frightened. Because I learned quickly that they were spies. They were spies from the army that was sitting outside the wall, and if anyone found who they were, their lives wouldn't be worth 5 minutes. I don't know why. I don't know why I did what I did. Because the strange thing was, I am no friend of men. I don't particularly care for men at all. On the other hand, there was something about these two. Something, they didn't look at me the way men usually did. And so when the soldiers came, and of course it was easy for me to see them from my high vantage point, my windows overlooked both the outside of the wall and the square. When I saw the soldiers begin to come, when I heard their feet on the stairs coming up to my house, when I heard their fists on the doors, I don't know what made me do it, but I took those men up to the roof and I covered them with the flax that was drying there. And when the men finally broke down the door and came in and they pushed me roughly to the wall, well, I held my breath for a moment there, but they decided to move on. And they searched everywhere in the house. They turned my cupboards inside out. They turned the bed upside down. They tore the clothes press apart. But they never went to the roof. And late that night, after the city had calmed to its evening hush, and the stars had come out, the time when most people would have expected me to be going to the marketplace, I let the men out the wall on a rope down from my window. But for saving their lives, I said, you must tell me one thing. When is the attack going to come? I have heard the stories. I know that your people have taken city after city after city. And though we are strong and one of the mightiest cities around, when is the attack going to come? Because I want to know when I can protect my family. My family never thought much of me. As I said, my mother and father were dead, and my sisters, well, they were all married and extremely respectable. But I still wanted to protect them if I could. And they said, because you have saved our lives, gather your family in your house and keep them there until it is over. And with that, they slid down the rope and they disappeared into the darkness. Well, the next day, I went out to the marketplace as usual, and I began to buy all of the great things I would buy. I would bought wine and grapes and figs and bread and all of the things you would buy for a party. And I invited all of my family, my sisters, their husbands, their children, and I invited them to come to my house. But my voice was almost drowned out because something very strange began to come from outside the wall. Something I don't think any city had ever heard before. Well, of course, everyone knew what an army sounded like, marching feet. But these marching feet didn't lead to the gate. When the king's soldiers slammed the gate shut and barred it and blocked it, the feet didn't come running with a battering ram. They simply walked around the wall. I mean, it was like just, they spent hours, days, walking around the wall. And every so often they would stop and they would blow these great horns that they were all carrying. And then they would walk some more. And then they would stop and they would shout. And then they would walk some more and round and round and round. I mean, by the time that I had managed to get my family's attention back and get them to decide to come to my house, after all, we're Hobbs' house. Well, we're going to have a party. There were actually people up on the wall having army watching parties. Because these crazy people were simply walking round and round and round, shouting, blowing the horns, and they were carrying this, the ones in the front with the long beards and the long robes, they were carrying this box on their shoulders. We didn't know. But I kept my family in my house. And every time it looked like they might want to go, I would send one of my servants out back to the marketplace to bring in more food, honeyed fruits, wine, keep the party going. I let the children sleep in my room. Some of them went up and fell asleep on the flax at the top. And so it went for hours and then days. It became like background noise. We simply, after a while, didn't hear the feet anymore. The people on top of the wall got bored. Even the king came out to watch eventually. And it was the day that it looked like the entire court was about to debark and go back to the palace. That was the day that all of the hubbub in the city suddenly felt like it had gone into some sort of, well, something strange had happened. Suddenly all the city noises seemed much louder than they had been before. And it wasn't until we stopped and looked out of our windows that we realized what had changed. The feet had stopped. There was no more marching, no more voices, no more horns blowing. And then, in that silence, came the greatest shout from all of those men and women and children outside the city. It seemed to shake the walls itself. And then we realized it was. The walls themselves had begun to tremble. And sooner, that sound of the marching feet that had stopped, that had been going so long and had stopped so suddenly, was replaced by the sound of small stones beginning to crumble, and larger ones, until finally the entire wall seemed to be collapsing around all of us. And I bent down and I covered my ears, and nothing helped, nothing stopped. The children were screaming. And then it was over. And as we waited for the dust to clear, I looked out my window one more time and pushed the red curtain out of the way and looked, and the wall was gone. Everywhere but where my house was in the wall. And all of those strange, armed passionate men, women, and children were sweeping into the city. I was sure that whatever the spies had promised us, that we were dead. I mean, how could they protect us? There were soldiers with swords and spears and every kind of weapon, and we knew that they would simply sweep up and, well, that was war. The men were killed, the women and children were, well, we don't need to go into that. But when I heard the footsteps outside, I don't know how, but I recognized them, and I went to the door, and there they were, those two spies I had met. And they came, and they took me by the hands, and they brought me down the stairs, and they took us, my family, me, the children, safely out of the city.